That poem is so poignant. And it speaks to something that I wanted to talk about today. I drove to Boston and back. That's why I wasn't here last week. I picked up my son from college. It was just a complete delight to do that. It was also really painful. I'm not 20, and driving in the car for 8 hours each way is really uncomfortable. And those bed sheets are unfamiliar, and all those different things that add up, and it kind of lingered. I think it's still lingering even a bit. So I found myself with a lot of physical discomfort, pain. And in this case, it's physical pain, but it can also be emotional pain that we're in. And when you study the Buddhist teachings long enough, you understand that pain is a great teacher. It's not something that we ask to come our way, but it's something that shows up quite regularly. But it's a teacher, and it's a window into today's topic, which is compassion, the second of the 4 Brahmaviharas. Also, in Pali, it's karuna, compassion. And my instructors over the years, the various teachers I've had, if there's one thing that's been consistent between all of them who've shared very different approaches to this practice, one thing's been very consistent, which is in times of pain, reach for the Brahmaviharas. And in this example that I give of physical body pain after a drive, it just persisted longer than my usual. So everybody has their usual levels of things. And then when something is more pressing, you notice it, it's kind of like louder. So I I took that wisdom from all these teachers, and I reached for a great book that I enjoy very much to reach for. It's called The Boundless Heart, which I've maybe mentioned before in class, by Christina Feldman. It's kind of a modern interpretation of the 4 Brahmaviharas. So I reached for The Boundless Heart, flipping through. I'm in pain. What can I do? And I came across a quote that's very beautiful and helpful by Helen Keller. She writes, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is full also of the overcoming of it." That's what we need, the overcoming of suffering. So Feldman writes on pain, "Pain is a universal and inescapable story. Suffering is part of the story of our body and of all bodies. Illness, frailty, aging, and pain feature in every life." And she goes on to say, at the heart of compassion, karuna, the second Brahmavihara, at the heart of compassion is the invitation to turn towards suffering. Just as the longing for love, safety, and respect is a universal longing and story, so too is pain. So the instruction is, at the heart of this compassion is looking to pain, our teacher. I want to share this famous story from the Buddhist teachings, Kisa Gotami and the parable of the mustard seed. It's a famous parable, it's one of the foundational texts of Theravadan Buddhism. And it revolves around this woman who's by the name of Kisa Gotami, and she lived during the time of the Buddha. So I'll read this to you. Kisa's only child, a young son, had died. Unwilling to accept his death, she carried his body from neighbor to neighbor, begging for someone to give her medicine to bring him back to life. One of her neighbors told her to go to the Buddha to ask him if he had a way to bring her son back to life. She found the Buddha and pleaded with him to help bring her son back to life. He instructed her to go back to her village and gather a mustard seed from each household that had never been touched by death. From those mustard seeds, he would create a medicine to bring her son back to life. So she went back to her village and began asking her neighbors for the mustard seeds. Each household she visited had some story about someone who had been taken by death, whether it was a child, a parent, an uncle, or a grandparent. None had been untouched by death. As the day became night, she was still without any mustard seeds. And according to the Buddhist, this verse her story comes from, she then said, she realized, it is not just a truth for one village or town, nor is it a truth for a single family, but for every world settled by gods and men. This is what is true. Impermanence. With this new understanding, her grief was calmed. She buried her son in the forest and returned to the Buddha. She said to the Buddha that she could not obtain any of the mustard seeds he had instructed her to collect, because she could not find even one house untouched by death. This idea of impermanence. And this story speaks in part to so many things we know are true. And it's a helpful reminder. And it also points to the metaphor of the second arrow. Buddha's metaphor of the second arrow. And the second arrow is this, I guess it's a parable as well. So Buddha said, if you were walking down the road and someone shot you with an arrow, it would go into your flesh and it would be very painful. If you took it out and someone shot you with a second arrow in the exact same place, it would hurt 1,000 times more because it was in the same place that was already wounded. And he uses this metaphor to talk about what we do with ourselves, to how we relate to our pain and how we create our suffering. In his teachings, the second arrow is our suffering. And this is what he referred to in the Four Noble Truths, the thing that he promised we could eradicate from our lives, our suffering. But it's two things. There's two arrows, because there's pain and then there's suffering. When you do a lawsuit, I think you sue for both, which is clever. But for our lives, pain, the first arrow, is the physical pain, the loss, or the unwelcome change, the illness, the unwanted thing in our life. That's the pain. That's the original. And then the second arrow is this suffering. This is the thing that we add on. And it's like our shame or our distress, our fear, our dissatisfaction or despair, like depression. It's these much larger things. And basically, what the Buddha is saying is that the second arrow is shot by ourselves into ourselves, and it comes from our wish for things to be different than they are. And all of the mental activity that goes around that desire. The stories that we tell ourselves of why it should be different, that we don't deserve it, things like that. That's the source of our suffering. So as I was reflecting on this, and I was reflecting on this teacher that had arrived in my physical body, this discomfort, I noticed my own stories of why did it have to be this way? Why didn't I do X, Y, or Z? Or what was I thinking? This image arose because at the same time that the stories were coming in, there was this natural compassion that arose in me, and it's from my practice, my Brahmavihara practice. This care. I was caring internally, saying, oh, it's really tough. Kylie, it's okay. What do you need now? How can I help? There was this sort of internal voice that was coming that hasn't always been there, I can assure you. But it was coming up, and it was helping. And it brought up this image of Star Trek. Maybe you've watched Star Trek. I definitely did. And I don't know, Captain Kirk would get into a difficult situation, and he would shout out to Scotty to put up the shields, right? And then this kind of like blue glow would go over the Star Trek Enterprise, the ship. And like miraculously, like the bullets for a while, like wouldn't hit the ship. It was like this protective coating, this magical protective coating. So that's the image that came to my mind of this practice of compassion. It's like a protection against our habitual energy of sending the second arrow into ourselves. If we can put up this shield of compassion around ourselves, we can really protect ourselves against that suffering. And so Christina Feldman talks about compassion in a really interesting way. And I'll quote her. She says, compassion isn't a state, it's not an emotion. It's an understanding. And she writes, it's an understanding rooted in the classroom of our lives and hearts, and a genuine and honest investigation of our own relationship to our own pain and suffering. And how I interpret that is that it's about not running away. It's about not trying to just fix everything right away. I mean, it's very skillful to tend to things and to want them to change and to be creative about it. But the initial energy when pain arises is not to run away from it. It's to have an honest investigation, to keep it in your awareness, to stay with it, to be with it. Which, it does, for a lot of people, that's not intuitive. And I can say that honestly from personal experience. Some, it's easy to confuse self-compassion with weakness, right? There's this belief that you have to resist the pain to keep it at bay. Which actually reminds me of a very famous, you see it everywhere, there's a very famous mathematical equation what is it? Suffering equals pain times resistance. Suffering equals pain times resistance. So suffering is our second arrow, equals pain, the first arrow, times resistance. So if you're resisting really, really well, really strongly, you're actually multiplying your suffering. And if you can get your resistance down to 0, right? Do the math. Pain times 0 equals 0. That's the path we walk. That's the practice we do. So this idea of compassion, it goes in two directions, right? We're compassionate to ourselves and we're compassionate towards others. It's very much mixed up together in that way. And what I want to point out is something I've observed is that a lot of people who practice meditation and mindfulness, a lot of my students and my colleagues are actually really kind people, really compassionate people. And they often care more for others than themselves. And there's usually a story there, like, hey, you're the tough one, you're the strong one, you don't need, you'll be fine. Or you don't want to appear weak. That's a big one. You don't want to appear weak. You're not worth it. You're not worth love and compassion. You might be dismissed if you're that way because it's culturally not a thing. Or maybe there's just not the what do you call it? The habit of it, right? The habit is different. The habit is to be hard on yourself. But kind people can be really hard on themselves. And mean people are even worse on themselves. So just to point out that there's a lot of room for improvement. And especially in our culture, there's a lot of room for improvement for this internal attitude of care for yourself, for your body, and for your heart. And so how do you cultivate compassion? And I'll say here, I'm going to put it to self-compassion. Because in my understanding and my experience, the more you practice self-compassion, the more it naturally, inevitably flows out to others. You almost don't even need to try when you can be truly self-compassionate. And I don't mean self-indulgent, and I don't mean selfish, and buying yourself whatever you want whenever you want, or just doing whatever you want whenever you want. That's not what I mean. It's this internal attitude of care for your own experience. And so how do you cultivate that self-compassion? So 3 things that come to mind from the Buddhist teachings. Number 1, use your own body and your own heart as your laboratory. Use your own experience. The Buddha always said, don't take my word for it, see for yourself. And there's a lot of wisdom there. So practice on your own experience. And how? So number 2, study your pain. Study your pain with your mindfulness practice, your awareness practice. So have that dialogue going. How am I feeling right now? Just knowing. You don't need to act. You just know what's going on in my body. How's my mood? What thoughts are present right now? Honoring what is inside of you. not indulging, not acting out, but knowing. And then asking yourself that question, what do I need right now? What do I need right now to take care of this? And maybe it's within your capacity, and maybe it's not. But having the awareness of what you need often in itself is like a salve. And number 3 on how to cultivate self-compassion is have patience. A lot of patience. We have to really slow down our minds and be willing to sit with what's going on. And when we are able to have patience with ourselves, our patience for others grows just naturally. And this process, when you apply your mindfulness and you apply patience, this self-compassion really grows kind of naturally. So encourage yourself tenderly with care. So just a recap. I wrote a recap here. It's a practice. That's why we call this practice. It's not perfect. It's a practice. When the first arrow comes in, you have your physical pain, you have your emotional pain, something's upsetting. First, say, yes, here is pain. Here it is. Yep, I see you. Second, slow down. Third, pay attention to what's going on. 4, listen non-judgmentally to your experience. And 5, cultivate that kindness, that compassion. It's all right, dear. What do you need now? That's like our shield. Because the second arrow is 1,000 times more painful when we fall into despair or shame or anger, aversion to the pain. That's the real suffering. So we have this compassion at our disposal that we can apply like a salve, and that's how the Buddha. That's what he would have turned to. And he was after the end of all suffering. That was his promise. So we can work towards that.